Britain looks run down and dilapidated. Nothing gets built, at least not on time, in budget, or well. And what we do have decays. You stand in the middle of the capital city, vaguely hoping that you'll hit a patch of 5G. You pay through the nose to use trains which arrive apparently according to lottery. The relationship between money in and service delivered is, to put it politely, puzzling. The same is true for many basic systems on which society relies, and everyone knows about the housing situation. One way to link all these questions, which aren't just whinges about modern Britain, is that they are questions of infrastructure. There are, of course, some high-profile political problems with infrastructure, the most obvious and headline-grabbing being the catastrophe that is HS2. That's the high-speed railway originally supposed to link London through Birmingham to Manchester and Leeds. It's now been reduced to just London to Birmingham, with the London terminus an open question, the price ballooning to over £100 billion from an original cost estimate of about £37.5 billion. And it's unlikely to be finished until the mid-late 2030s. And now suggestions are that its trains might not actually run at the high speeds it was designed for. But costs, delays and madcap schemes, I think perhaps we'll talk about bat sheds today, they're hardly limited to HS2. And the political consequences here are important. Failures of this kind can poison the well for future projects and can destroy any general sense that the country is capable of achieving anything. And it can be spun into evidence for your preferred political argument. Is it the inefficient bloat of the state, or is it the anarchic rapacity and avarice of private firms to blame? It can lend itself easily as well to a politics of nostalgia. Weren't the Victorians able to build astonishing civic infrastructure? Why then do we huddle in the ruins of their greatness? And these questions are, of course, especially relevant right now, given the likely coming change in the leadership of the Labour Party. Questions of infrastructure, which are also, of course, questions about who gets what and what goes where, have been a key part of Andy Burnham's tenure up in Manchester during his mayoralty, and they are, of course, an urgent part of national politics as well. But perhaps there's also something difficult about wedding the long-term questions about infrastructure with the ever shorter cycle of politics and political coverage in this country. And isn't that, after all, what Keir Starmer has discovered? You're listening to On Politics on the LRB podcast, and joining me in the studio are two expert guests. Gillian Plimmer, infrastructure correspondent at the Financial Times and an essential read on the rather vexed stories I've just been talking about. And Mathew Lawrence, founder and director of the think tank Commonwealth, whose extremely interesting recent essay on the productive state over at the New Statesman will, I think, have some bearing on our conversation today. Welcome both.
Hello.
Hi, James. Hi, Jill.
Jill, I'm going to come to you first. I mentioned HS2 in that introduction, and I think it's pretty widely considered a bit of a disaster. I mean, it is actually being built, over time, over budget, and much reduced from what it once was. Why is it such a catastrophe? I know it's a big question to start with.
It is a good question. I always think Euston Station is the best metaphor for the whole of HS2 because they started demolishing buildings sort of 10 years ago, I think it was 2016, and kicking people out of their homes, closing businesses, pubs that suffered. All kinds of people have paid quite a price. And yet, sort of 10 years later, there's this sort of massive demolition site, and they still haven't got a plan for what actually to do with that Euston Station and how to get the trains in and what to do with the HS2 station and how the whole area will be developed. So that's sort of a starting point that I think illustrates of just how badly it's gone wrong. And of course, the really big issue is now we have the remainders of HS2 being built, and it'll go from a station outside Birmingham to a station outside London in its first phase. So you're going to have to change trains to go anywhere decent, further slowing it down as well as running the trains at slower speeds. And that's not going to open for, at least another decade. And the cost has soared to, I think the latest estimate is 106 billion, but probably suspect it might go higher than that.
And so people point to planning. People point to sort of stakeholders and objections and things like that. People talk about the sort of slowness of construction, whether that's at a firm level, whether it's whether there are delays in supply chains and things like that. And of course, there's the question of accommodations of various kinds. So there's been lots of conversation about the tunnels that have had to be dug at various points and all this stuff. And it certainly seems that all of those have a bearing. Is there an overwhelming explanation that you tend to think is sort of the primary explanation for its problems?
I think the best explanation really is that it was the wrong project right from the start. So, HS2 was lobbied for by contractors, a bit like Northern Powerhouse Rail is now. There are a lot of contractors on that board pushing for it. Doesn't mean it's right or wrong, but it's a big factor. And they started getting consent for the project when the designs were still at a very raw stage. There were whistleblowers who have spoken out, Doug Thornton for one, and who was working on the project, and they said that all the sort of cost estimates were done from their desks. They weren't visiting sites. So all the costs were sort of made up and wrong. And by the time it actually got government consent, I think they'd done possibly less than 15% of the planning. And that was true, and that came out again in a big report called the Oakavy report, sort of in, I think it was about 2021. And again, I think for the second stage of the line, we were still at like 17% of the planning had actually been done. So there are lots of different factors, but I would say that was a big contributor. And of course, a lot of people were getting paid a lot of money throughout this process, and that included consultants and lawyers and planners and everyone else, and hence the cost has rocketed.
The cost factor just
higher
seems
than the space mission or something.
Absolutely astonishing. Matt, can I bring you in here? I mean, that question of consultancy, these sort of various, it's almost like those diagrams you see in school of trophic levels of sort of there's extraction happening at every stage. And is that typical of these projects, or is it an HS2 specific thing?
I think it's extreme, but not unique, and therefore it is instructive. And I think it goes back to that point that the state is both bloated but weak, because we are an outsourcing state, but we are not a sort of producing, investing and doing state. And that then sort of feeds into a set of structural problems that result in higher costs. And sort of infrastructure condenses many of the problems of the state and its relationship to the economy and how it constitutes the economy in sort of really instructive ways. So partly there's that sense of there's this stop-go pipeline, partly because of political uncertainty, partly because of just a whole set of social and economic factors. But then capacity atrophies, supply chains wither, the sort of construction sort of sector in the UK is very sort of undercapitalised. That then flows into sort of higher costs. You've got the consultancy state in which there is this chronic outsourcing of responsibility and expertise, and a state which cannot see and make the economy legible does not know how to control costs, doesn't know how to intervene, doesn't know how to decide. And I think this speaks to sort of what Dan Davis wrote about in the unaccountability machine, in which responsibility for deciding and then doing is severed, cut up, sliced apart into sort of different contracts, and complexity is monetized. And so at each of these different chains, the outsourced state, the kind of consultancy state, complexity adds cost and it adds delay. Then you sort of layer in the kind of excessive gold plating in which, to avoid political friction, you build tunnels rather than just building on top of the land. And then you sort of layer in treasury back and forth. They were over-optimistic at the start. They then panic at the cost towards the end, and you end up with the absurd spectacle of, a sort of a line which was heralded as connecting Manchester to London with record speed, stopping nowhere near Manchester and potentially not even stopping at Euston. And so I think it's, in a way, you want the state to be sort of do less but do more. Be stronger at its core and its core functions, and that is how you control the costs. Whereas at the moment, we just have this kind of unaccountability machine that generates opacity, but clearly lots of extraction at whole layers of the system.
So HS2 is one thing, right? So that's where there is what the French would call a grand projet, although Mitterrand managed to pull them off in a way that Britain hasn't, and perhaps there's something to learn from the old French socialists there. But there's another side of this stuff, and we'll come on, I think, maybe to discuss exactly how expansive or narrowly defined we should think about infrastructure, because I think it's a very difficult question. But Jill, one of the things you've been writing about is a different kind of infrastructure, which is something that already exists and on which all of us rely, which is the water that comes into our homes. And I think most listeners will recognise or know that Thames Water has been in significant trouble. It's looked like it's on the verge of collapse for a long time. I think people will be used to seeing significant leaks in the street and be aware of the increasing difficulty that Thames Water has had in sort of upgrading its infrastructure. The explanation that's usually reached for, certainly by progressives, is that, well, this is a case of a natural monopoly being privatised, and the people who privatised it essentially taking money out of the utility to pay dividends to their shareholders, and therefore that the revenue is not going into fixing the infrastructure. Is that an accurate accounting of what's happening, or is it more complicated than that?
Oh, I think that's a fairly fair assumption. Thames Water is probably a good example of, the worst case scenario where you have private investment that hasn't had a sort of public ethos surrounding it or been held to account by regulators. So it has essentially been left to do what its investors need to do. So the investors obviously have another job, which is to deliver returns to their shareholders. And you can't really blame them, but that is exactly what they've done. And that's why, Macquarie, extracted a lot of money out of Thames and left the infrastructure in a pretty bad state. But the other investors have done the same because that is their primary job. Macquarie isn't a water engineer. It's an investment firm.
You mentioned regulation there. I mean, one of the arguments people make is that bodies like Ofwat, which is the water regulator, are just incredibly subject to institutional capture, right? That the people who are sitting on them do not regulate the firms that they're supposed to regulate in the way that they ought to, that there's a I was about to say rotating door. I mean, a revolving door, I think, is
yes.
between those companies and the bodies that regulate them. Is that a really significant problem?
I think it's an issue. It's certainly part of the story. So, Johnson Cox was at Anglian Water and then he moved to Ofwat. Catherine Ross was at head of Ofwat and then she moved to Thames. So, yeah, it's clearly part of the story. It's not the only issue, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, to defend regulators, but then I think to hopefully make a fatal thrust against regulation as the solution, is that they are put in a fairly impossible situation. There's this deep information asymmetry. How can the regulator know more about the regulated entity's business model? The only possible way to know that is extraordinary bureaucratic complexity and invasiveness of this state body into this private entity. And so, ironically, the privatised regulated model is a much more bureaucratic model of infrastructure and utility sort of delivery than just sort of straightforward public ownership. And then the second thing is that so much of the politics and the kind of political economy of infrastructure sectors rests on the cost of capital, and yet they're in this sort of impossible situation in which the more they try and bear down on the regulated entity, the more the regulated entity says, well, that's going to sort of create more risks, and then we're going to price risk into our cost of capital, and they will pass that on to consumers in the form of higher bills. And of course, the one sort of option on the table that has the guaranteed low cost of capital of all is, of course, public investment. And that's the one thing regulators are not allowed to deploy. And so they're in an impossible bargaining situation, essentially.
Yes, and they didn't have incredible powers till recently. Ofwat was pretty constrained in what it could and could do to companies.
I'm curious about the difficulty in regulating these things. As you say, there's this sort of information difficulty. And I mean, certainly the compliance must be a fairly significant burden on these industries. Is that right? Or is it
It is nominally, trivial? But if you look at the big court cases, I mean, Southern Water, for example, which got the record sort of £90 million fine in 2021, I mean, and these were always presented as sort of isolated cases, but, we don't really know how systemic it is. But, in that case, it was incredible. Their staff were actually told to cart sewage away from the sewage treatment plants to avoid the inspectors and to, hide site diaries. I mean, in that case, it was pretty obviously a criminal act.
Yeah.
So,
if I may take us back very briefly to Mitterrand, because I think it's really important. The British state and its public corporations were very capable of grand projects. So let's take the energy sector. In the post-war period, it was not the French, sort of nuclear, sort of atomic golden age of the late 70s that sort of led the world. It was the British publicly owned, vertically integrated energy sector that built the first major fleets of nuclear sort of power stations. They were some of the first in the world to bring liquefied natural gas onshore in sort of Canvey Island and other places. They built the supergrid at massive scale and at low cost. So they were capable of extraordinary transformations, infrastructural transformations. It's just that there has been a political project of deliberate unlearning of institutional capacity through deregulation, through privatization, through outsourcing. The state has been forced to lose that capacity. And it's not that the French are somehow because of their political culture, because Mitterrand eats, birds under cloaks and his dying act, etc. You'll have to look that up, listeners. But, it's not a fixed thing. It is historically contingent and therefore can be remade.
Well, I mean, it's a nice way I was going to ask a question about infrastructural successes in Britain, of which, there are some that partial and I think not uncomplicated. The two that I reach for instinctively are Crossrail, which was a little over budget.
Not much, though, because I think that was a success because they cut the budget. They had a budget, then they cut it, and then it came back a bit over the original budget. So to some extent,
the usage is extraordinary. I mean,
and it was the right project. It was needed, and no, it's amazing. We love it.
And I think there's latent demand for infrastructure that is under-recognised, both sort of by modellers but also by sort of the Treasury's Green Book. And for example, if you built a Crossrail, which geographically leads to the Wirral, is probably no much further than kind of the east and western sort of flanks of Crossrail, I would imagine the expected ridership versus what would actually be the uptake would be by some margins bigger in terms of on the upside.
Yeah.
And the other project I reached for, which is again a London one, and there's an interesting question I think about regional disparity there, is the super sewer, which is more or less finished. Cost of £5 billion. So this is the important upgrade to the London sewer system, which means that there'll be less kind of sewage outflow into the Thames. The first really, really significant update to the Victorian sewer system, built by Bazalgette in the mid-19th century at a cost of £4.2 million at the time, which is something like 450 million in today's money. Now, that's an entire city's sewage system built to way beyond the capacity of the Victorian city, quite a forward-looking, far-sighted thing to have done. Now, a partial upgrade to that, the super sewage, real significant engineering project, absolutely, comes in at the cost of £5 billion. So, obviously, there are some costs which have changed between now and the Victorian period. We have better working conditions, people are paid better wages, things like that. Matt, does that account for all of the kind of inflation in price here? Because it seems to me a significant part of this conversation is that it just seems to cost a huge amount of money to do things in Britain at the moment.
So there are multiple causes of the cost. If we sort of step back and say, well, what is infrastructure? It's kind of a foundational layer that has certain qualities. It's not sort of so much the material. So it's not, is it a pylon? Is it steel? Is it concrete going into a super sewer? It's actually that it's positionality in the economy. What does it enable? What is it upstream of? And because of those characteristics, it tends to be very capital intensive. It tends to be kind of very long-lived, networked, often with monopoly characteristics and essential. And those qualities, they are just by their nature quite expensive. These are very, as I said, capital intensive, require enormous sums of fixed capital investment to build. Now, those same qualities are the things that, as someone like Brett Christophers, the sort of economic geographer, says, inelasticity of demand, its essential qualities to society, its monopoly or sort of quasi-monopoly characteristics. That's why asset managers like to pile into these sectors, because they have those sort of characteristics that make them stable, index-linked returns. And so you can find examples, and I think it's important to not just be bluntly for or against public or private, but you can find examples like the super sewer where you can get that cost control and that delivery. But I think Brett himself uses that example of saying the financing cost of that, the difference between public versus private investment means even though it was delivered, the actual bill payer will be paying an enormous amount more over time in terms of the arbitrage between public and private cost of capital differentials, for no extra physical or infrastructure output, the public will be on the hook for paying more. So even when you can get that cost control, there's a question of like the actual cost will be more very often because of the economic characteristics of infrastructure if it is delivered through highly financialized private means relative to more vanilla public investment models.
Just to expand for listeners who are not necessarily economics head.
So the cost of capital, so often sort of you'll have a sort of weighted average of the cost of capital for sort of a capital stack investment project, let's say, infrastructure project. And that will be a combination of sort of equity returns, so the sort of amount that shareholders who can put their money in a whole bunch of places, very mobile, how much they're expecting, often 9 to 12%. And then the risk premium for sort of debt holders, which sort of for private companies or private lenders, is always going to be higher than the state because the risk of default is always going to be higher for a private company than the British government. And when you sort of combine those two and then add in that sort of financial complexity, the fact that Macquarie is involved as much in financial engineering as real-world physical engineering, those three combine into a higher cost of capital. And then if you think about it this way, sort of the cost of capital compounds over time. So even if it's sort of only a sort of 1% difference, over time that will compound, depending on the upfront investment, into potentially tens of billions of pounds more, that we will fund, the captive public will pay for through their bills, but for no extra benefit. And so there's a sort of political economy dimension here of upward extraction. By choosing to finance infrastructure through private finance rather than public investment, we are choosing to redirect resources from ordinary households and businesses upward to the financial sector.
Jill, one of the things Matt was saying there is about how to think about infrastructure, right? And how expansive or constrained a concept it can be, right? So this is less about whether state or private sector is involved in its construction, but just for a sort of sense of the stuff that we're talking about. In your work, you seem to reach into all these various areas, sort of social care as much as water or rail. What for you defines the sort of bounds of what we think about as infrastructure?
Well, I think one reason that I've expanded it is because investors themselves have expanded what they will deem as infrastructure. And because investors are, falling over themselves to find infrastructure investments, especially ones that are backed by the state, so they receive a steady income that's more or less mandated by the state. So if you get care homes, for example, obviously the state has some obligation to provide care, and it's just an essential need, and that's the same with water and energy and all kinds of things, even children's care homes. And because so many of them want the stable government-backed income, they are expanding their definition themselves to almost anything that includes that, and I've followed them.
That's really interesting. Do you have a sense that there's a move of, there's some sort of estimation on investors' part about the risk that their capital faces, in perhaps sort of private sector, more conventionally entrepreneurial projects, and they want to find somewhere where there's a sort of safe haven and a guaranteed return? Is that a general pattern?
I think the general rule is that they want a more or less guaranteed return. So, they like a toll road because you're going to get a return from it. And the government, particularly the Conservative government under Cameron and Osborne, tried a little like this government to get pension funds to back new infrastructure projects, and that proved very difficult. And in fact, they set up this big fund, and all the infrastructure funds then invested in second-hand private finance initiative projects rather than new infrastructure, because there's a lot of risk with new build infrastructure projects. So, then the government has to come up with complicated means to lure them in to investing in new infrastructure projects. And generally, say in the case of the Tideway or Lower Thames Crossing, or the energy projects or water, it provides pretty big guarantees that ultimately, these are such essential services that the government will bear the cost of any failure.
I think on that, there's that sleight of hand between sort of investment in the sense of fixed capital investment in building something versus investing in owning financial claims on income streams attached to already built assets. And I think part of the problem is so much the sort of infrastructure investment funds. There's a number of problems. Firstly, there's a maturity mismatch. So often these funds are sort of closed funds. So after 5 to 10 years, they have to sort of distribute to the original investors.
And sales.
Exactly, and sales. They've got that maturity mismatch between infrastructure that should be built, that sewer systems being built today, the sort of super sewer system that will outlast everyone on this call, so on and so forth. There's a maturity mismatch. They also want yield straight away. And they also, not unreasonably, so this is not a morality play, it's just a sort of thinking through the logic, they want infrastructure that's already built, that's already generating income. They don't want to take the risk of a 15, 20, 40, 50-year patient capital project. And in fact, that then bends you back towards, well, which is the actor in the economy which is best placed to mobilise its balance sheet to undertake long-term fixed capital investment? And it is the state. There is a reason why the UK is unusual in the degree to which its infrastructure has been outsourced and privatised. It's essential infrastructure. Because I agree there's this sort of expansion of what constitutes infrastructure. And I think not everything can be infrastructure, otherwise it loses its analytical clarity. But there has been that expansion. But when we're particularly talking about those core foundational infrastructures, there is just an economic logic as to why the public sector in large parts of the globe is much more involved than it is in the UK.
The magic of the super sewer, of course, is that, new legislation was passed so that investors could receive a return even while it was being built. And in some ways it sort of raises the whole idea of, well, what is actually investment? Are they actually putting money in? I see the government keeps trotting out the line that, the water investors are investing 106 billion of money into the water and sewerage network, and actually that money is coming from our customer bills. So it's a bit more complicated than investors sort of donating money to the system, which is
there
how
is no
it
magic
sounds.
money tree. I mean, there is.
I agree.
It is applied to the state rightly, but also this assumption that investors are giving us a free lunch. The public, one way or the other, will pay for infrastructure. The question is, do we layer on these extra costs of financial extraction? That's really the core of it in terms of the distributional politics.
Yeah. Something you were saying was reminding me of some years ago when I was reading. I think it's Eric Olin Wright's book, who develops based on the sort of, I think for a while it was quite widely known, the Meidner Plan, the idea that the trade unions could administer patient capital and really do this sort of long-term investment stuff. I think probably the scale there it just isn't there in terms of the resources available to British trade unions. But it is worth thinking that, there can be institutional investors, that are governed by rules, internally agreed rules, which differ from those of, global private capital. I think they probably can't outcompete them. I think that's probably the case. I mentioned, and one way in thinking about this is, of course, historically, and we go back 150 years, you have lots of sort of local institutions of the kind that no longer exist, local clubs, subscription things that are involved in building what are sort of initially private enterprises. There's a regional question here, and there's a regional question that plays into national politics at the moment, because obviously the question of whether the Mayor of Manchester is going to become Prime Minister of the United Kingdom has people thinking about the long-standing regional disparities. And, that is an infrastructure question. It is a question about really where that investment goes. How bad is the regional disparity in terms of infrastructure in Britain?
I think there are two main legacies that speak to the regional disparity of the last 40 years. You mentioned Andy Burnham, he had spoken of this 40-year settlement. I think the two core things to that is, first of all, the privatisation and outsourcing of the delivery of essential goods and services, housing, energy, sort of water systems, broadly infrastructure. But then the second thing, which is really important, is the centralisation of political power in Whitehall and in London, and the kind of stripping back and destruction of the autonomy and ability of local governments to finance local infrastructure. So if you look historically, the sort of municipal gas boards, which were, again, these were things developed by Chamberlain and sort of figures of the political right, they sort of ultimately contributed towards their sort of peak about 20 to 30% of local government income. And there were some municipal enterprises, infrastructure enterprises fundamentally, but that was all stripped away. And I think the interesting thing about this is not all about saying Whitehall should deliver this. It is about saying the city mayors, the city regions may well be the spatial and political unit by which you can deliver the sort of appropriate scale and nature of infrastructure. And there's a really good paper by Thomas Aubrey, who is a kind of financial specialist, but looking at how local government and infrastructure is funded in the UK versus the Netherlands. And the key difference to why the Netherlands has much deeper and better infrastructure in those regions outside of sort of the capital is that they are allowed to finance their own infrastructure, issue their own bonds, and then sort of finance it against sort of the base of the fact there are 3 million people living in this area that will be paying for the train network or the tram network, or whatever it might be. So I think the regional disparity comes down partly due to privatisation, and then partly due to the political centralisation and things like the Treasury Green Book, which maps out and sort of sets out how one can undertake investment. And there's this centripetal, I always get them confused, but force in which you kind of get into this doom loop of, well, infrastructure's here, so investing in the southeast and London makes sense because there'll be high returns, and then the more you invest, the more there's the returns, and the rest of the country is starved of capital investment. And then what's worse, sort of Commonwealth had the think tank I run had a report out the other day looking at Leeds City Council. This then creates another doom loop in which local authorities like Leeds are having to sort of sell off their existing infrastructure and assets and use those capital receipts to pay for sort of PFI projects, to pay for existing, and so they're cannibalising their own tail because there's this centralisation of investment in London and South East. The rest of the country is then falling behind, and then they need to almost like liquidate existing assets just to keep afloat. And so we need this real rebalancing, which is not to be against London, but it's to be for the rest of the country.
You're listening to the LRB podcast, and stay with us as we take a very short commercial break. You're listening to On Politics on the LRB podcast, and I am speaking with Mathew Lawrence and Gillian Plimmer about infrastructure and its politics in Britain. So people reach for explanations for this stuff. So the Whitehall one is obviously central, but there are other factors. So planning disputes is one, and the government has been really forthright in saying, like, we're going to change the planning system, and it's a real obstacle not just to housing, which is one of the big kind of questions here, but also transport infrastructure, energy infrastructure. You know, in the medium term, it will probably apply to computing infrastructure as well. Is planning an important part of this question? Is it all the NIMBY's fault?
I mean, I tend to, as a NIMBY myself, who objects to some of these tower blocks being built in Peckham and Southwark, where I live, I can get quite NIMBY-ish. And I feel the planning part of it is often overstated. I'm not saying it's nothing. The Lower Thames Crossing, for example, had 359,000 planning applications, and obviously that does push up the cost. But there is also an argument to be made for democracy that I don't want a tower block built next to my house. And I think it's important that we do have a say. And some of the government's planning reforms concern me, let me say. So especially the ones around the environmental regulations, where it seems that, local communities won't be protected to the extent that they were previously.
I mean, there's, I guess, another kind of question here also about the firms that carry this stuff out. There are these kind of, consultancies which run these kind of objection schemes and things like that. But then, as far as it gets, to building these projects themselves, there's a question about the structure of British capitalism, which seems to me, in particular in construction, to favour, and I'm not talking about the firm that nominally carries out the project, but actually the people who carry out the work are often in these extraordinarily sort of atomised, tiny structures. Is that a real problem, Matt?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you look at the UK construction sector relative to peer economies that often do build faster and at lower cost in the UK, the construction industry in the UK tends to be sort of smaller. It tends to have very thin margins. It tends to be thinly capitalised, so it struggles to kind of deliver that sort of scale of investment. And there's a lot of, as you mentioned, sort of deep subcontracting where risk is passed around the system, and nobody in the chain has the sort of deep enough balance sheet or the kind of view to sort of undertake decision making. But I think in a way that is downstream of some of those upstream problems of this weak state, but a bloated state. So that you don't have that capacity online because you don't have a sort of secure, stable investment pipeline because you've got this sort of outsourcing state. No one in the system is kind of responsible and drives and steers and directs, and therefore like the construction industry can sort of respond to that demand and plan ahead. And so it's this, some of these sort of structural symptoms are why we're worse. And sort of on the planning thing, again, I think there are clearly some things, whether it's kind of the prevalence and frankly the explosion of JR, judicial review, and sort of the risk of that, statutory consultations of Lower Thames Crossing, for example. These are things that both add to the complexity, add to the cost. But again, I think that partly goes back to sort of the Dan Davis unaccountability machine argument of there is this abandonment of control, partly because the state is not a productive state, it's this kind of outsourcing state. And therefore, there are few actors who can say, we can internalise the cost, we can internalise the benefits, and we will get on and deliver it. And so I think planning is an issue, but also the Spanish have environmental regulations, and yet they can build the Madrid metro faster, partly because they've got in-house capability. They maintain a team rather than stopping and starting. The French state, do the French care about sort of la France profonde? Of course they do. Of course they do. But they have when it comes to energy, a vertically integrated state entity that can undertake and internalise decision-making more quickly rather than this very adversarial, legalistic mode of decision-making, in which is a reflection of the outsourcing of authority and decision-making.
On my way here, thinking about NIMBYism and thinking back to, reading accounts of when the railways were built in Britain and the question of political cultures and the question of popular mood. It seems to me as soon as a project is announced almost anywhere, there's a number of people going, oh, I'm not going to like that. Oh, that's going to be, there's going to be construction. There's going to be, it won't get done and it'll be very expensive and I'm not going to be able to use it anyway. So what I'm saying is you compare this to the mood of people who were utterly thrilled by the coming of the railways, right? I mean, I think of that. There's this wonderful Turner, that very famous Turner painting, Rain, Steam and Speed, which is this painting that's just full of movement as this train sort of barrels into actually directly at the person looking at the painting. And there is that sort of very strong sense, or was historically that strong sense, that this infrastructure was going to arrive and change people's lives. I think it's not unreasonable to turn around and say, well, when was the last big infrastructure project that had a notable positive effect on my area?
Well, I think the Elizabeth line, actually, which was a good project, didn't suffer that many objections. It may even have been none, but I could be wrong. Mm-hmm. But I think that's the thing. If it's the right project and it's in keeping with the environment and it's nicely done and they bring on the community, it tends to be much more popular and sail through without objections or serious objections.
Yeah, I agree. And I think if you take the railway speculation, I think that is a sort of the historic trajectory of that is a sort of parable of infrastructure more widely, which you often begin with sort of speculative manias of private capital bustling in there, getting going, taking a risk. Then there's often sort of wobbles, essentially. There's consolidation. And then there's rationalisation, and then very often there's public ownership. That is very much the story of railways, energy, other core infrastructures. And, infrastructure, the other metaphor I was thinking of in terms of trains and modernity infrastructure is like, it is the locomotive of history. To have infrastructure coming in is about modernisation. It's about the future. And so I think that sense of like, it is directly benefiting people works. And then I think, the third thing I'd say is, the big investment in infrastructure right now is into, and so it's globally, and certainly in the US, but to an extent in the UK, is compute, in which there is enormous fixed capital investment, very much, to my mind, potentially in a sort of the speculative bubble stage. And therefore, I do think you will see more and more, whether it's through the axis of sovereignty, whether it's cost control, whatever it is, public options in things like compute, and just like private investors have expanded the scope of what constitutes infrastructure. I think there'll be a demand that compute becomes part of the infrastructure. Conversely, I think there'll be a counter movement, a kind of Butlerian jihad, which is a term I sort of saw a little while ago on the kind of deeper reaches of the internet about sort of the movement against like compute and massive data centers, etc. which I thought was like, wow, I've not read that Judith Butler paper. What's that? It turns out it's a phrase from the sci-fi series Dune, which I always thought was like a parable of like colonial resource extraction. But I haven't read it because I know that he turns into a giant worm or something, and I'm like, I don't want to know what Timothy Chalamet's path is. Anyway, I do think that sort of sense of like some infrastructure will mobilize, and certainly if you look at the US, but I think it will come to the UK and elsewhere, infrastructure can really mobilize because it speaks to sort of different visions of modernity in the future and who benefits and who doesn't. And so I think if you think about compute as the kind of apex of infrastructural transformation at the moment, I think it will be an intensifying site of political conflict.
And just to say, I mean, that conflict in the United States is very much about sort of land use, water use, energy use. It's sometimes forgotten, although I think, as you say, it's going to be, an increasingly dominant part of politics over the course of this century. But it is still sometimes forgotten that there is very, very tangible material infrastructure underlying our so-called kind of cloud services and, our access to so-called artificial intelligence. I think that's absolutely right, that this question is sort of bearing down on us. And I don't think we necessarily have great ways to think about it yet. As is often the case, I think, in the early sort of speculative stages here, you divide into like total skeptics, which I am congenitally sympathetic to, or kind of total proselytizers who think AI is going to fix everything. But it leads us nicely into the question of ownership, right? So the question of who owns what or who owns, various parts of our infrastructure is obviously a vexatious and politically important one. One of the things that's been sort of very obvious in this conversation is that infrastructure, one way of looking at it is something that exists to allow the dynamic functions of a market to actually operate, sort of inside it. So it's the kind of precondition for a sort of functioning, mixed economy society, as it were. And what your proportion is and where you think it should lie is obviously going to differ according to your sort of political beliefs. Now, both sort of left and right have pretty strong answers to the question of like who ought to own infrastructure, or how infrastructure is best provided. But I'm wondering if either of you have any sense of some strong counterintuitive examples. So the accusation that's often leveled from the right is that, well, state-owned infrastructure is astonishingly inefficient. It's very, it doesn't achieve the things. It's very bad at innovation, and so on and so on. And the argument from the left is that, well, privately owned infrastructure is all about just sort of robbing the state and robbing the public for the enrichment of various shareholders. Are there case studies which suggest otherwise?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think one can look at Britain's own past and contemporary peer economies in which public infrastructure is that foundation that then allows a more dynamic economy to be built on top of it, peer economies that are richer and more equal than Britain. So I mentioned it briefly before, but the track record of building out at speed and cost control and distributionally fairer, because the costs were recouped through progressive taxation, not just on bills. Infrastructure is very regressively funded at the moment. It's essentially a poll tax that we all pay the same amount regardless of income. The public energy sector, both municipal and national, built an extraordinary scale and speed, transformed the country, massive modernisation project. Similarly, you can look around the world now, public infrastructure is, whether it's water industries, transport industry, or sort of infrastructures, energy infrastructures, sort of care and social infrastructures, more efficiently delivered at lower cost for higher quality. But I think there's kind of two other things I'd say. I think, first of all, the case, I think, is best made through sort of practical and not ideological grounds, certainly to build a sort of large-scale sort of coalition and a new common sense. And so it's about a means, not as a sort of totem. So it's about saying, okay, in this infrastructure, what delivers the levers by which we can control costs, deliver investment at scale, deliver quality? And that's about sort of mission clarity. It's about balance sheet strength. It's about retaining and developing capability so you can sort of bear down on the sort of cost curve and sort of learn by doing. It's about insulating from short-term pressure and putting the public interest first. Then the question becomes, well, which institutions can best map onto those things. And very often, but not always, it will be public entities in those core infrastructures. And so that is why you think that will be the institutional means, not a sort of predisposition, but just thinking through what is the characteristic of the good, the infrastructure, the sector that we're trying to develop out here and scale. The second thing is, though, this conversation has been a bit about sort of the mechanics, the business model, but I do think there's a kind of, from the left, a political sort of theoretical argument for rethinking infrastructure, which is, you mentioned earlier, sort of who gets what and who bears the cost. And I think kind of equality as a kind of liberal egalitarian principle, I think, is really important, but I'm not necessarily sure that's the anchoring principle of the left, which instead is about freedom individually to be the author of one's own life, freedom collectively to be free from the injuries and the hierarchies and the unfreedoms of class society. And then how does that freedom map on? Well, it maps on freedom in production, so freedom from exploitation in sort of the wage-labour relationship. That's one thing. But then freedom from expropriation in social reproduction, which is where infrastructure is fundamental. If your care services, if your energy systems, if your water systems are just sites for extraction in which social surplus is extracted out, in which we cannot control our future, or we have a state or a public body or a public voice that is so weak and bloated that it cannot direct it, I think that is a fundamental loss of freedom in that collective sense. And then therefore, I think we can think of infrastructure in that sense. We can anchor it in a kind of different conception and more expansive conception of freedom, of capability, of moving beyond kind of exploitation, expropriation sort of dynamic that people like Nancy Fraser and others sort of point to as the kind of core political order of capitalism.
I think the ownership question is quite complicated because it often blurs. So HS2 is a public sector project funded by taxpayers, and yet it uses mostly private sector contractors. And then you get the water industry, which is paid for by consumers through their bills, but it doesn't really matter whether it's bills or taxes. Either way, consumers are paying for it. And yet it has a layer of private investors sitting above it who were meant to bring private sector discipline to the field and innovation, and have clearly failed to do that. And no one else has actually followed the model that Britain has, where they literally sold off, for a song, all the boreholes and water mains and, sewage treatment plants and land surrounding it. But other countries have used contracts. So, and then you get the French government, which is fond of a sort of hybrid model where, they will own 51% of airports and private investors will own the other 49. I mean, I think it's fair to say that the argument that private sector discipline necessarily brings benefits hasn't yet been proven, and it's been tried quite extensively. But that also, there are also big public sector failures, as we all know. And I think it's also fair to say that private capital is more expensive. Mm-hmm. And so, you need to sort of find out, are there cases where private sector investment or private sector equity at the beginning at least, or debt, has actually brought about some discipline?
Yeah, I think that just being case-specific, tool-specific rather than blanket is really important. But while you were sort of talking, Jill, it sort of reminded me of this great quote from FDR that the energy historian who's brilliant on all these things, Arthur Downing, who's got a book coming out on the history of Britain's energy infrastructure, which I can recommend. But FDR said the case of public ownership is that it is both a sort of birch rod and measuring stick. So it is both a actor that can discipline private capital by saying, well, we can build this, we will do this, we can displace you if you're not doing it properly. And it is a disciplining mechanism to, where markets work, let markets thrive. Where they don't, or where there sort of a hybrid model is more effective, they can be that disciplining rod. But they're also the measuring stick, which goes back to the problem in the British state is that we've sort of outsourced so much. We're not a productive state, we're a kind of contracting state, but then it's very hard to make the economy legible and make infrastructure legible. Whereas if you do, which is the measuring point, if you do, you begin to learn, you begin to know, hold on, are we being taken for a ride by this contract? Is this actually good value for money for the public? Are taxpayers being on the hook for this? So I think that sense unless we make the economy legible by doing, we are always going to be on the back foot in terms of negotiating value for money. It is important to make the point about how we recoup the cost between taxation and bills is actually important in the sense like bills fall as a flat tax on the consumer, whereas if it's funded out of taxation, you can ultimately tweak the progressivity of how it's paid for. Yeah.
So you could do that with bills.
Could do that with bills, but it becomes quite like complicated. In a way, the tax system's set up to do that, I guess.
I think my other point would be, of course, really what we're talking about is monopolies here, where there is no competition.
Yeah.
I'm not particularly arguing that, this public sector would run Morrison's better, although at the moment.
Well, that's an example of like private equity coming in, sort of selling its underlying asset base and then closing all these.
Yeah.
And the sort of cafes in Morrison's, my colleague Sash Hildhorst has done some really great work on Morrison's. These cafes where you could sit all day for £1 for a cup of tea was like essential to community in those places. And the private equity model has come in and displaced it. But I do think, Jill's probably right, like it's a spectrum here. There are many essential sectors which it is not appropriate for public ownership and provision. So for the food retail market would be an obvious one.
That depends what happens.
It depends what happens. Yeah, exactly. I think it should be contingent and not fixed.
But if one were to try to make these changes in the UK, so obviously we have coming down the line at us probably a significant change in the leadership of the country. How significant remains to be seen. There are some obvious problems here. Obviously there's kind of institutional resistance in all of these sectors, but that's true of any kind of change. Is there a more kind of fundamental problem in Britain of being like a state that is really strongly tilted towards rentierism of various kinds, right? So the thing that you want to do is to find something that gives you basically a guaranteed income for doing very little with it.
Yeah.
And that seems to me to be like, prior to any of our question about exactly how you should set up these things, what vehicle you use, the fundamental problem here. Is there a way of getting around that and making some changes?
You're the think tank.
Thank you very much. So yeah, exactly. I think infrastructure condenses some of these structural features of Britain's frontier capitalism model mentioned earlier, but Brett Christopher's sort of diagnosis, I think, is fundamentally correct there. And I think you can see that in a number of dimensions. You can see that in a professional services, in many ways brilliant, highly competitive, but professional services in which complexity is good. If you ask a lawyer, hold on, should we build a bat tunnel? They'll say, well, yes, because you want to de-risk it. Whereas rather than saying, this is what we want to do, let's do this. And I think partly the sort of professional services complexity complex, the fact that the state kind of is not a productive state, it doesn't invest and own, it kind of outsources, is part of the problem. And partly the financial sector is increasingly like a toll collector in the infrastructure sector. It isn't an investor in new infrastructure. It buys up existing assets, sweats them and collects the toll. So I think, and that weighs down the economy as a whole. That manifests as a cost of living crisis, manifests as the rentierization, which then slows the dynamism of the wider kind of economy in which the foundations are built upon. How to change that, I think, starts by recognising the constraints the British economy faces. There are real both the resource constraints and sort of geopolitical pressures that bear. We are not in the 2010s when you could borrow enormous sums for virtually no money and build infrastructure at scale, and didn't. And that was a historic tragedy and political mistake. And so therefore you have to think through much harder the sort of sequencing and interventions. Again, Mitterrand, the other lesson is, of course, retreat in the face of financial market pressure. So you have to think much more carefully about this. I think partly to me, and this is very much Commonwealth's view, can't speak for anyone else, it is partly about taking on those twin things I mentioned, privatisation of essential services and centralisation. So it is about saying, devolve the right to our city regions, the ability to finance, own and invest municipal transport networks, about setting up public housing corporations that can do that role of sort of aggregating land to build on top of. Right now, we've got this perverse thing with the land market in which property developers, they can buy the land to assemble to then develop if they do the highest bid. But of course, then the consumer's on the hook for that. So there's this weird tension between, like, if you want to accumulate land to then develop, you pay over the odds, and then you recoup that by charging more for housing. So you've public housing corporations across the country can build up and assemble land to build lower cost housing on. And then I think you have a sequenced sort of role for the state in terms of those monopoly networks. So the grid, to me, sort of scaling low-cost capital to develop out. Now, you have to sequence that clearly. You have to signal a clear plan. You have to say, if we don't do these things, the failure to build infrastructure is inflationary. It leads to higher energy costs, higher housing costs, higher transport costs. That is what the bond markets price into the higher cost of gilts. And so this is about...
How about the potholes?
Potholes are, exactly. The potholes increase the demand for tyre repairs, which increases labour demand, which, is a wage-led demand pressure in the economy. The failure to maintain infrastructure, then, so it's like squeezing a balloon. The failure here leads to cost pressures here ballooning. Yeah. And by failing to get on top of that, that's what exposes us to the judgment of the bond markets, because there's excessive inflationary pressure in the British economy because we've underinvested chronically in these core essential infrastructures. Unless we got on top of that, we are always going to be exposed. But there is this tension because you then have to manage that process of how do you modernise infrastructure while recognising Britain's position, twin deficit, fiscal, trade deficit, geopolitical tensions. These are really serious things that need to be navigated and thought through. But unless we get a grip on infrastructure, it's very hard to either fix the cost of living crisis over the long term or build the type of dynamic, competitive, sort of prosperity-generating economy that too few parts of this country share in.
I have a final question for you both, and it's based on the assumption, and I think it's a reasonable assumption, although I wouldn't, say it's 100%, the assumption that Andy Burnham will probably be Prime Minister at some point this year, probably sooner rather than later. Obviously, anyone coming into office has a million claims on their time and a million voices saying what they should do. But it seems to me like infrastructure, in the sense that we've talked about it today, this kind of fundamental, underlying layer that allows you to build a sort of dynamic and functioning economy on top of it. That's going to be really important. Is there an obvious and low-hanging policy he should reach for pretty much as he comes into office? What should his first infrastructural move be? What would be the most tempting thing to do?
I mean, I'm not going to say what he should do, but it is interesting that he's, even since this whole fiasco started, he's, shifted his position on water. First of all, he said we need more public control, which is very vague and wishy-washy. And now he seems to have moved towards, renationalisation of Thames Water. So I think what's interesting is that, he may not want to do anything. His track record is that he's given more state control on the buses and generally been throughout the political spectrum, sort of gone with the flow. So he was a Blairite and etc. But now I think, people are fed up, and actually even the sort of water industry and the owners aren't making much of a defence of privatisation per se. They're just saying, well, renationalisation would be very expensive. So, and the public is clearly for renationalisation. That's played out in all the YouGov polls and all the sort of campaign groups that we see doing, important work around the country. So he may just get pushed towards the left. I mean, and meanwhile, there is the issue that £7 billion a year is going on HS2, and they are cutting back they've even cut back the frequency of the West Coast Main Line, I think, to pay for HS2, as well as lots of electrification projects.
Just to say, that is a crazy fact, isn't it?
It is a crazy fact, isn't it? I know, exactly. I had to get it in somehow. But so it's, what he does will be interesting to see.
So I can't obviously speak for Andy Burnham at all, but I can sort of argue what the Commonwealth position would be. I think, just that's right, there's the politics out there. People are angry and they feel ignored, and they hate the dependency of not being able to have infrastructure they can rely on, not having, the basic features of life, energy, transport, care, water, just being reliable and there and cost effective. So I think there's something to mobilise into kind of new common sense there. And as you say, Jill, the defence of the status quo is well, it's difficult to change things. If things were easy to change, people would do it sooner. So I think it's not, it is a hard thing, but that's why it's necessary. I think On the supply side dysfunction, which is core to this point around infrastructure, I think the thing I would say is like ownership, not just control. Control can get you quite far. The B network, frankly, a thing they could do potentially say like, by the next general election, every voter in a city region will be going to the polls on a bus that is now in a public transport franchise. The visible, because it's about constituting communities. Infrastructure creates political communities. Suddenly you're sharing a shared infrastructure. You're not just sort of disaggregated and segregated by market provision. You're sharing this thing, and that constitutes that commonality that is conducive to progressive politics. So control can get you some ways, but certainly in those core infrastructures, particularly monopoly networks, in the medium to long term, to me, it has to be about thinking through, not in an ideological way, but in those practical ways, what maps onto what those infrastructure goods and services are required, and what are the best ownership and investment sort of structures to deliver good outcomes and value for money for the public. Those are long term, though, and right now, people, I think, are screaming at politics to do something more on the cost of living crisis. That is difficult, going back to those trade-offs and those constraints. But I think something that targets, in the near term, a kind of demand strategy that targets those core drivers, inflation, energy, transport, so on and so forth, a strategy that can do that is both a political offer to say, we are trying. I think a lesson from Zoran Mandan in New York, and I'm going to over-index on that, but just the very sense that he's trying and he's failing, even if he fails, he's failing upwards and he's really going for it and he's positive and he's trying. And that's the political offer. But the economic offer is to say these measures are inflation controlling, and that then reduces the pressure from the bond markets. And that then gives you space down the line to undertake an investment program that delivers the time of infrastructural transformation, which is fundamental to the long-term prosperity of Britain. And if we don't do that, and if we just keep muddling through and relying on this bloated but outsourced state and fragmented but inefficient private actors in terms of scaling the investment we need, the coherence, the certainty, the cost control, and we rely on excessive centralisation of economic and political power, we are going to be stuck where we are. And, what happens to a dream deferred? It explodes. And that will be the political trajectory we'll be on unless we can grip this problem.
Well, that is, I think, a good place for us to leave it. Mathew Lawrence, Gillian Plimmer, thank you.
Pleasure.
And if you have enjoyed this conversation, you will, of course, enjoy reading the London Review of Books in the new issue, which is online today and in newsstands very, very soon. You can read Adam Thirlwell on Maxim Gorky, Simon Skinner on the World Cup, David Todd on the Marquis de Morez, the first fascist, Joanna Biggs on the memoir of Lena Dunham. Thanks for listening.